I certainly want to thank each and every one of you for being with us today. For those of you who are supporting the Carter Center financially, thank you so much. For those of you who are thinking about it, thank you so much. And for those who have just shown up because this is a topic of interest, we are delighted you are here. Most of all, we want to thank you for the trust that you have placed in us as an organization. Mark Williams, our Senior Associate Director, Natasha Roberts, our Assistant Director. Together, the three of us are in your debt for taking the time and for your trust, quite frankly. With us today, Steve Johnson and Patricia Angus. They will be holding forth here in just a moment. I will be introducing them in about a minute, perhaps less, but I want to give Mark Williams, who is my co-host today, an opportunity to say hello and tell you about the disclaimer, because he is a trust and estates attorney. Trust and estates has nothing to do with it. Attorney has everything to do with it. So Mark, please.
Thank you. Well, suffice to say, we've got a few attorneys on the call today, so we just want to make a few things just really clear right up front. We're not giving any legal advice or financial advice today, and also just want to make sure that we let you know no relationships are created by this. It's a strictly educational webinar. But aside from that, we do want to take a moment to say also, thank you for joining us. This is not going to be a very technical type of talk, but instead will be something that is much more important, I think you'll find. So again, thank you. And Barry, please, would you mind doing our introduction?
I will be delighted to introduce these two folks. I have known them for several years now, and they are both members of the Carter Center's Philanthropy Council. And I won't say more than that. On the screen right now, you can see Patricia's short, very, very abbreviated bio, and the next slide will have Steve's very abbreviated bio. Suffice to say, they are experts in their field. They've worked with families and individuals to help them establish their vision and get comfortable with their vision. Most of us, whether we admit it or not, are really, we avoid the conversation of our own demise. And that, I know lots of 80-year-olds and more, older than that, who never prepared a will because they figure if they don't, then they're not going to pass. Before you create a will, or you've already done it and you're thinking, well, maybe you need to revise it because it's been 5 years or more since you last looked at it. Taking a step back and thinking about your values is what's most critical. And to help you understand the foundation of those discussions, we have invited Patricia and Steve here today to explain what that's about. And without taking another moment, Patricia, perhaps I could start with you and just thank you again for being here.
Thanks so much, Barry, and delighted to be here for this topic that is near and dear to my heart, where I've dedicated my professional career all these years. We'd like to get to know you a little bit more, and why don't I hand it over to Steve so he can sort of take it from here, and then on we'll go. I think especially for the people who are watching this on a recording, we're going to give you some work to do. So pull out a piece of paper or an iPad, and Steve, what can we start with?
Well, I just want to echo you, Patricia, and just say we're delighted to be with you. We want to thank the Carter Center for inviting us to participate in this webinar on legacy and values. And while Patricia and I are in fact both lawyers, this is going to be a decidedly unlawyerly session. Values and legacy are the soft issues that make many lawyers nervous, but in fact are a rich opportunity to engage clients in very important conversations. We're going to encourage you to ask questions throughout the hour. Type them into the chat box. We'll get to them as quickly as we can. We'll then have a few minutes at the end of the session for open Q&A. But as Patricia says, enough about us. Tell us a bit about you. Our friend Mark Williams is going to project a very quick poll. We want to know what it is about the session description that grabbed your fancy. So take just a moment, please, and respond to poll 1. Let us know when the majority of folks have responded, please.
Of course. We'll take a few more seconds.
Okay.
All right.
The results are in.
The results are in. We have fairly even split this time. There's a 50% group, looks like maybe multiple answers. I'd like to know how to define my values, receive 50% vote. I'm working on my estate or philanthropic plans, likewise received a 50% vote. And I help others with their estate or philanthropic plans, receiving 50% of the vote.
Okay. Well, we're at 150%. That's as it should be. All right. Let's start with defining just a couple of terms. Mark, if we could have the first slide. This is a definition of values from our friend Merriam-Webster. In my work at the Philanthropic Initiative with Generous Families, I quickly discovered that values are almost always the appropriate point of departure. Values are your beliefs about what's important. They inform your views about life, about relationships and wealth and philanthropy and a lot more. They define priorities. They guide your choices. They shape how you relate to people, to work, to play. In short, they're a compass, your North Stars. In a word, they're really important. So, Patricia, what's a legacy?
A legacy, if you can flip to the next slide, Mark. Steve and I agreed that we wanted to keep with a simple definition because it's really the action that we're gearing towards. But a simple definition of legacy says that it's something transmitted by or received from an ancestor or predecessor or from the past. Okay, most people don't really read that definition or think about that definition. Most people think that a legacy is a lot of money by somebody who's really famous and really important. And it's, you have to have your name on the building. And if you don't have your name on a building, then you're not leaving a legacy. Well, we are here to tell you today that that's not true, that you will leave a legacy. Everybody you've ever met has left a legacy, whether they know it or not. And I think about this just this morning. I was looking at a picture of, I have several great nephews and a great niece. And this morning I looked at a picture of a great nephew. And not only could I see his mother's eyes and his father's eyes, I could see his mother's eyes and his father's face and his father's spirit and his mother's ingenuity. I could see it all in that one face. And that is the legacy we're all leaving. It's physical attributes. It is experiences that we've had. It is, money that you leave. It is collectibles that you leave. It can be as small as a teacup or as large as a, Van Gogh painting. You leave a legacy. The question is not so much whether you leave it. Let's put that question behind us. And today, think about what will that legacy be? And most importantly, does your legacy reflect your values? And how can you make that happen? Which from my experience, Steve, it takes some work. And it takes work without judgment. And you've spent a lot of time thinking about all of this. I've thought a lot about this. Why don't we find out what everybody else is thinking about it? Mark, if you could put up our next poll. We have two questions here, and if we can pop up the first for you. Let us know whether you've had experience with creating a personal values or mission statement. Have you personally sat down? Maybe you've done it at work, maybe you've done it with your community center, maybe you've done it at school. Do you have a personal value statement or a mission statement? Yes or no? And Mark, I'll just leave it to you to end the poll when we have enough results from it.
Great, that sounds wonderful. We're closing in on our time now.
Thank you. Thank you. And I just want to reiterate, we are not going to judge you whether you do or you don't. And we're just trying to figure out where you are on the experience level here.
So we've closed out the polling.
Yeah, 67% have said they do not have a personal values or mission statement, and 33% have said that they do. That is pretty much in line with what we would have expected. Most people have never sat down and articulated their values and have not sat down and articulated what their mission is in life. So let's just put that as sort of background for how we understand you. Let's think the next thing we want to know about you goes back to a quote that my father apparently, which I found out after he was gone, was one of his favorite quotes. It's one of mine. No man is an island. We all are connected and we can never do anything singly. You have your individual, you have your family, you have your community, you have your larger world that we're a part of. Mark, could I ask you to pull up the next poll so we can find out, looking at the family level, how many on the call today have actually done a values exercise with their family? And again,
Fantastic. An immediate 100%. I don't know that you all will be surprised by the results.
Really? Okay, thank you. We have honest people on the call today, and anybody who is on the video, let it be known that no one on this call today has ever done a values exercise with their family. So all of you who have tapped into the video, you are not alone. That is about what we would have expected. And we understand that this is rare stuff for people to do. So we all have work to do. Steve, what should we do? I mean, you're saying values matter, and really we're not getting together with our families, and very few of us have done it on our own. How do we get started?
All right. Well, Mark, if you would project the next slide, please. Well, there are several ways to identify values. They come from formative experiences. Those experiences can be positive, for instance, loving, supportive families, or they can be negative, toxic, unsupportive families. They can occur early or late in one's life. Yes, we are still capable of having formative experiences that illuminate our values. People are also a source of values. Initially, families, teachers, later mentors, job superiors, religious leaders, national leaders. Historical figures too can be sources of values. I spent time at the universities of Pennsylvania and Virginia, founded by Presidents Franklin and Jefferson, respectively, and I do believe their ghosts gave me an appreciation for freedom and justice and democracy and beauty and creativity and so forth. So just by way of illustration, Patricia, I'm sorry to single you out, but would you be willing to share a formative experience and the values it imparted to you?
Sure. And I've thought a lot about, the values that you're born with, the values that you learn in your home, the values that you acquire along the way. When I think of a formative experience, I can't not think about it because it's Christmas time. And every time I go out and get a Christmas tree, I think back to when my parents made sure that every year when we bought our Christmas tree, and one year we did chop it down, It wasn't necessarily a smart idea. But when we got a Christmas tree for ourselves, we got one for somebody else. And the person we got it for was the woman who was cleaning our house. And we were not at the level where we had housekeepers all the time. So it was a big deal to have somebody come clean the house of 5 children running around all the time. But my parents taught us through that there was somebody else who may not be able to afford what we could afford, that we were fortunate, that we were going to be generous people, and that we were going to make sure that we did it in a way that would make a difference in someone else's life. And these are values that I've just lived with all my life, that being kind, being generous, and sharing what you have is just the way you have to be. That was a value that we grew up with.
Well, I have heard that story before, and I always appreciate it. I think that's a lovely illustration of where values can come from. So, for you on the call in the meeting, I want to ask you to do a really quick exercise. Just jot down, if you would please, your 3 top values. And then we're going to show you a values inventory that is a long list, and we'll see if your top 3 appear on the inventory. We imagine they will. Sometimes they're not. Take just a moment, please. Okay. Has everyone got their list of 3? We imagine you do. Now, Mark, if you would project the values inventory, can you make that fit the slide somehow? Probably not. No, that won't do it. This, by the way, giving credit where credit is due, was borrowed from the Peninsula Community Foundation, which no longer exists. It was subsumed into the Silicon Valley Community Foundation. So that's how old this inventory is. But Mark is scrolling through the list of values that we often hear. Patricia, Barry, Mark, do your 3 top values appear on this list?
Actually, Steve, I'm surprised by some of them. I never thought of beauty as a value or comfort, quite frankly. So your list is sort of expanding my understanding of the terminology.
Yeah. I once had a client in my TPI years, philanthropic initiative years, whose philanthropic mission, whose foundation's mission was devoted to the promotion of beauty. And she had done a tremendous job of doing that in the city of Flint, Michigan. In any case, you get the idea. And to Barry's point, sometimes inventories like this one can suggest values that are in fact important to us that just haven't really registered in our consciousness. So I find this a useful list to look at from time to time. We don't have time to get into personal value statements, but they're what they sound like. They are a statement of principles to guide us through good times and bad for life as well as for posterity. A favorite philanthropic initiative client of mine began his values statement with a fundamental precept from the Christian tradition. To whom much is given, much is required. And this spoke to his values of gratitude and humility, but also to obligation and community. And later in his values statement was his favorite quotation: give a person a fish and they eat for a day, teach a person to fish and they eat for a lifetime. And this bit of wisdom, which is attributed to every tradition under the sun, informed my client's deep belief in education and guided his philanthropy throughout his life. A bias against charity in favor of building skills and education and enterprise creation. So with that, Mark, if we could have the next slide. So yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about family values. Patricia, do you want to tell us a little bit about poll number 4?
Yeah, sure. And Steve, I think I've worked more on the sort of estate planning side. You've worked more on the philanthropy side, and there's such a convergence here that what I've found is, there's lots of ways to get to your values, but then there's the question, are you in line with everybody else? Because you may own a business together, you may want to do philanthropy together, you may want to decided on some sort of multi-generational wealth plan at any level. I'm not saying you have to have a lot of wealth, but you have to figure out, are your values in line with everybody else? So let's ask the audience again to fill out the poll and let us know, what do you think? Do you share your family's values? And this is something that I always do with clients, because we're inevitably talking about something that requires more than just them.
I do
Mark,
want to
how's it
remind
looking?
people, this is all anonymous. So
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And
Anonymous
so-
and no judgment. Yeah, exactly. No expectations either.
As soon as you said that, we hit 100%.
Oh, fantastic. Great. Okay, and we have honest people. No one has said absolutely all the way. For the most part, I think this is about what we would have expected. So for those who are watching this later, 17% said somewhat, 50% said for the most part, and 33% said absolutely. I would just feedback that from my experience working with families for 30 years-ish, often people think that their family values are different from their own, that they're not in line with the family. And then they have to do philanthropy together. Then they have to run the business together. There are actually ways to focus on the commonalities. And for the most part, and somewhat, are some pretty good answers. If you think it's not at all, it's unlikely. And if you think it's absolutely, it's hard to know which family you're talking about. Often families on the other Carter Center event that we had like this, somebody very honestly said her values were very much in sync with her children and her spouse, but maybe not so much from the family that she came from. And so she wasn't so sure about that. And she wanted to do some more work on that, which gives me a chance, I would say, to feed it back to you, Steve. How do you think about this?
Well, the simplest way to identify family values is through a simple exercise. Get the family around a table. You can have to be around a table. It can be a virtual table in Zoom land, and get each family member to list his or her top 6 values, say, and then find the intersections. I once worked with a family at the Philanthropic Initiative where the first generation believed strongly in leadership and merit and diligence, and the second generation was grounded in conservation and nature and healing, and and both generations believed strongly in education. And for the last 20 years, they've found that intersection, funding wilderness leadership education, investing pretty heavily in NOLS, the National Outdoor Leadership School, and Outward Bound. So we'll talk a little bit more about values and philanthropy in a minute. It often is helpful to determine if your values are in line with your significant others. Mark, would you share the personal values matrix that graphs personal values with one's significant others? Yeah, once again, this is hard to see. It's really for illustration purposes, but essentially create a simple grid list values down one side, and then chart your values. And then this becomes a bit more interesting because it asks you to rank your spouse's values as you understand them, and then to speculate about your spouse's view of your values. And this is really an exercise as much about knowing thyself. It's also about knowing thine other. It's about self-awareness and transparency and relationship. And you can
Steve,
certainly...
after families go through this, do you also provide divorce assistance?
That's never happened, Barry. This is an amicable, kinder, gentler kind of exercise, but it can be very revealing on a whole bunch of levels. So you get the idea. You could add additional columns for additional family members here, but I think the simple exercise around the table is usually plenty. So you get the idea. It's not rocket science. Let's segue from values to legacy. Patricia?
Yeah, although I might jump in quickly with the question we just received, which was if a family feels or if you're working with a family and their values appear to be miles apart, what do you do to harmonize them? And I think exactly what you almost answered the question as it was being asked, that there are some tools and there are some techniques, and you've just shown one of them, which is that you identify both and then you work together. You're facilitating them. From my experience, just to answer the question that came up in the chat room, very rarely do people not have any values in common. Often what happens is the words they're using are different and their interpretation of the words that somebody else is using are different. So you as an advisor have a job to help them focus on the commonality and to distinguish. I like the distinction between strategy and tactics. Tactics is like, what do you do right now? And strategy is what's for the long term. And values are the longer term overarching, ways of thinking about it. So it's an excellent question. And Steve, we could address that in the Q&A. I just wanted to mention it because it was in the chat box.
Right, I've got some thoughts on that too, but remain on schedule here. I think you are...
Yeah, Mark, if you could move to the next slide. What I want to do is think a little bit about the legacy discussion, right? We've already agreed that legacy is going to happen whether you define it or not. One of the places where your legacy and your values show up is in your estate plan. Your philanthropy often shows up in your estate plan. And so I'd like to hear from people, do you believe your estate plan reflects your values? Imagine you've done all the tools, all the techniques, you've got your estate plan and you've got your value statement. If you looked at it today, do you think that they would be in sync?
Patricia, while people are thinking about their answers, is an estate plan and a will, are they the same thing?
An estate plan would be larger than your will. An estate plan would be the overall that you're doing. You might have your will, you might have a trust, you might have some LLCs you've created, you probably have your power of attorney and your healthcare proxy and your living will, which is really your instructions for what happens if you're ill. So I would say estate plan is larger than that, larger than just a will. Mark, how are we doing?
A few more answers coming in.
Okay, great.
Reminder, everyone, this is anonymous and judgment-free. All right.
I like that we have honest people on our call today. So those of you who watch it on the video, the response is on the whole, 57%. Very much 14%, and I don't know 29%. I'm glad to see that nobody on here says they don't have an estate plan, because if you don't have one, it would be great to create it now. Okay, how do you think about your estate plan? How do you think of all of this? Mark, if you could go to the next slide. What I find is that some people are really good at doing work on values. Some people are really good at doing their wills and their trusts. Often the wills and their trusts are primarily driven by taxes, and they're primarily done almost in a moment of crisis. I remember having to take a taxi up to somebody's home as they were about to head off on a vacation from New York City, and we literally had them sign their wills outside their home before they jumped on vacation, because it was the first time that this couple realized if they were gone, they had 3 small children, and they didn't know what was going to happen to them, to their children, if they were gone. So that's an estate plan, meaning a will plus, Barry. That's when you need it, how you need it. Were their values incorporated into it? Unlikely. Your estate plan ideally should define your legacy in the way that you want it to. Let me tell you about somebody who didn't do it. Alfred Nobel woke up one day and he read his obituary. Now, wouldn't that be interesting if you could read your own obituary? I mean, that would be sort of cool, right? So he's down in the south of France and he opens up the paper and it says, Alfred Nobel, doctor of death, responsible for more people dying than anybody known to humankind, died today. Well, he hadn't died, obviously. His brother had died and the person writing the obit had gotten the names mixed up. But Alfred Nobel was not too happy with finding out how people would talk about him after he was gone. And so what did he do? He decided to define his legacy. He actually had an advisor who helped him think through for the rest of his life. He turned it around by creating the Nobel Peace Prize. It's how we all know him now. He actually tried to foster the development of people who were leading the way in all sorts of areas. So you've got literature, you've got, peace, you've got a whole bunch of areas of the Nobel Prize that he specifically said, I want to honor that. And now when we think of Nobel, we think of the Nobel Peace Prize. We're not really thinking about Doctor of Death. It sounds trite, but think about it for yourself. If you were to read your obit today, what would it look like? Have you defined it? Have you gone through the values? Does your estate plan reflect it? If you really believe in government and all you've done is cut taxes in your estate plan, I don't know whether that means that you've lived your values. If you really care about an organization and you have been contributing to them every year of your life, and then you die and the contributions stop, have you had your values continue? Have you really made sure that your family actually knows what your values are? Have you discussed it with them? A story that I often tell is about a client of mine who did all the right things, wrote her wills, wrote her trusts, did everything she needed to do, and realized that her kids weren't going to feel so warm and fuzzy when they, woke up the day after she was gone, clutching a will. And so what did we do? We had her write a letter to them that was called an ethical will, which is from somebody get my word right here, the Jewish tradition of ethical wills, which is tell people what your values are in writing, articulate it, make sure you say to them what you hope for them in their life after you. And then she went home and she didn't just hand this over to them, she had a conversation with them. And she had several conversations with them. Sadly, she died not much longer after that. She was a young person. And when I met with her kids afterwards, what they talked about was the fact that she came home, and I'm getting a little bit teary about this, she came home with this, not just on paper, but in her heart and in the conversation with them. And that's sort of how you incorporate the values into your legacy, is you have the conversation now. If you put it in your will, live it now. And you have to do the work to get there. So let's think about the philanthropic side. Steve, do you have thoughts on that? Because that's almost more of a process that you have to go through.
Yeah, well, the wonderful thing about philanthropy is it can be a canvas on which one can paint, sketch one's values, one's aspirations, one's dreams. First, just a real quick disclaimer about the word philanthropy, which some people object to. For many, it's loaded. It evokes images of Gilded Age barons and tycoons, or even new era tycoons, the Gates, Buffetts, and Bezoses of the world, but it's truly a noble word for a noble concept. It comes from the Greek philos anthropos, which means love of humankind. One of my favorite definitions of philanthropy came from Peter Goldmark, who was the president of the Rockefeller Foundation. And Peter said, philanthropy is your use of you. So it's not only about giving, it's about doing. Maybe it's even about being. It's volunteerism, every bit as much as it's about dollars. So, Mark, do you have the, excuse me, the giving pyramid queued up there? Or can you grab it? Okay. So this is an illustration of how in my philanthropic initiative days and today still think about about philanthropy. As you'll see, values form the base of the pyramid, and from values, everything else flows. Focus, vision, mission, goals, strategies, and importantly, outcomes. They obviously, they inform where you focus your giving, but also how you do your work. How do you relate to your beneficiaries? How do you relate to those with whom you're giving, your fellow trustees, for instance? If learning and education are high on your list of values, you may not only be funding schools and learning programs, you may also want to emphasize learning about how to be a better donor. If power and control is an important value, and let's be honest, for some it is. Your giving may be somewhat prescriptive. It may even be autocratic and top down. And that's not always a bad thing. Usually, but not always. So let's look at the alignment, sometimes the misalignment of personal and philanthropic values. Mark, if you wouldn't mind projecting the motivational values exercise. So this again is a useful tool. It's about ensuring some kind of alignment or identifying misalignment, which can really trip you up, between personal values and charitable values. In this case, we were working with a foundation. And sometimes there is a lot of alignment, and sometimes there is very little. I was once giving a lecture, and I had a guy stand up in the back of the room, and he said, I wrote 400 charitable checks last year, and about 6 fully aligned with my values. And so that's a sobering realization when it happens, but better that it happened than not. So Barry, just by way of illustrating the alignment of personal and charitable values, can you just say a word about President Carter and the alignment of his values with his philanthropy?
His primary value, I believe, is his faith. It structures everything he has done throughout his lifetime, from beginning to end. I believe that integrity is a great part of President Carter's values, as is honesty, humility, and focus. He is perhaps the most focused person. His first book was called "Why Not the Best?" and it was inspired by Admiral Rickoff. And sorry, I had a cat just jump on my lap and claws dug into my leg, which is why the winds. I think those sum up President Carter's values pretty well.
Well, from what I know of President Carter, that's spot on. Quite a wonderful legacy to all of us. He really is a treasure. Thanks, Barry. Okay, so suffice it to say, values are really important to philanthropy, to your use of you. So just in time, as I cough, Patricia, back to you. Tell us about how to leave a legacy, and I think we're going to roll into it with with poll 6.
Yeah. Here's the bait and switch on you. We're not going to do this poll for you today.
Okay.
So we are going to put it up. And I think you all have to think about this when you look in the mirror. I think everybody who's watching this on the video has to think about it. If you were Alfred Nobel and reading your obituary, if you were President Carter and looking back at your long life, if you were any one of us trying to figure out, what is that legacy I'm leaving? What's, in addition to the eyes, in addition to the teacups, in addition to the art, maybe a house, maybe a few dollars, maybe not. What's that legacy? And one of the things that's interesting about legacy is that it sort of goes both ways. It's partly what you intend to leave, but it's also what people see that you left. So think a little bit about that. There's a study up at Columbia recently that they've done on people and their philanthropy. And they have actually done a study that shows that your philanthropy, if you do it with integrity and authenticity, and if people respect what you've done with your philanthropy, it will alter the way that people see how you've made your wealth. So you may have been in the exact same business as somebody else, and you may have the exact same number of dollars in your bank account, but you may have a different impact through your legacy in the way that you're doing your philanthropy. So I think it's a really interesting study that's showing that's intertwined between your values, the alignment, and how you're perceived. So let's get on to the sort of to-dos, because we're into the time period where hopefully we'll be heading into some questions and answers and maybe a discussion. Mark, if you can go to the next slide, be great. So I've worked with families for almost 3 decades now on these issues. I can't meet with a family without values being a part of whatever it is that we're discussing, whether it's implicit or explicit, whether it's in writing or in behavior. And what can I tell you that I have seen that works? What I think works is be intentional about it. Don't let your legacy happen without you being the author of it. If you are raising children, and if you see your children acting in ways that aren't necessarily the values that you would have wanted to instill in them, maybe you have some work to do. And Mark, I see you smiling. I know you have a 4-year-old son. And it's not just you, Mark, it's everybody else. That's your legacy, not only your son as a person, but the values that you are teaching him on a daily basis. He will remember when he becomes a father himself. Hard to believe he's only 4 years old, right? When he becomes a father himself and he starts teaching his children lessons, your words will be spoken. And your words and your action are going to be spoken to him. So be intentional on how you want to do it. Be comprehensive. It's a lot to think about your little 4-year-old being a father or a grandfather. That's when it will come out. The words will come out of his mouth. Be comprehensive. Don't just put it in your estate plan. Don't just put it in a value statement that applies to your giving. Put it in your file with the will that your children will receive. Put it in the conversation that you have, not necessarily on Christmas Day, not necessarily as you light the lights on Hanukkah, but at a moment where you're saying, okay, family, this is what I believe in, this is what matters, and this is why I want you to, what I'm trying to teach you. We don't always succeed in what we're trying to teach. In your business, okay? I'm sure that there are some people who will be watching this video who own businesses. If you're very philanthropic in your personal life and you haven't thought about your business's role in the community, probably time to think about it, because what we're also talking about is alignment. Steve used the word alignment. We're all thinking about alignment. How are you going to align those values across everything that you're doing? And it's sort of almost a spoiler alert, like values, their time has come. Millennials love alignment, and they love aligning their values with what they do. This is the future. We have systems thinkers in younger generations. They are seeking this not just out of businesses that they invest in, not just at the businesses they work for, but also in the families and in the interactions they want to have across wealth and philanthropy, including your family. I don't think I even need to say that anymore, because to me, you can't do this alone. You're doing it with your family. Living your legacy, I've talked about. If you would put it in your will, why not do it now? And allowing room for change and evolution. I had a call earlier today with a family, and what we were working on was succession in a business. And what I was trying to help them understand was that the new leaders will do things differently from the old leaders. The common values will be the thread, but there has to be some room for some change. There has to be some room for people to say, have you thought this is important? And often the wisest people in the room about values are the youngest. I'm thinking about a family that I met with in the Midwest, and we did a values exercise with them, and the 10-year-old nailed it. In just 10 words, they got it out there and said, these are our family values. And everybody looked at them and said, how do you know that? Because they had just been observing all of their 10 years. So change, evolution, and articulation, I think, are all really important. Steve, do you have any other, tidbits, or should we just move on to Q&A? What do you think?
Well, we should. I will just read a very brief statement that I found only today about legacy. This is Peter Karoff, who founded the Philanthropic Initiative. And Peter once said, and I'm so pleased that I came across this bit of his writing, he said, legacy is a very big deal. If anything deserves our complete attention, it is how we leave things. Legacy assumes the end game. It assumes we're not here. And the tea leaves that are left are up for interpretation by others. And I thought, what a spot on reminder. Peter's legacy, Patricia, I know you knew Peter, is kindness and innovation and generosity and friendship and family. And I can only wish that my own tea leaves would be so clear and so admirable. Anyway, I'm glad I got that out. I'm glad I found it today.
It's a wonderful summary that you just had there, Steve. And I'm thinking this morning I threw a tea bag down and the tea leaves went everywhere. And I think that's another point of legacy. You can't really control how people perceive your legacy. You can control your actions and your behavior. And I appreciate that we've had this question show up in the chat box again. So thank you. I'm going to read it out and we're going to discuss it a bit. If we work with families to define their values together, are there any techniques that could help us align or harmonize their values if their values are miles apart? Steve, why don't you think? I already gave a few thoughts on it. Do you have thoughts?
Well, I guess I would opine that there may not appear to be commonalities and overlap and synchronicity between or among the family's values, but dig a little, and I would be surprised if there is not some commonality somewhere. And one way you could approach that exercise is to ask the first generation to imagine values that they may not have initially listed, but which they imagine may be important to the next generation. And then ask the second generation to do the same for the first. And it is looking deeper. It is trying to know and understand one's children or parents, for instance. And I would be surprised if the value of family or love or healing or friendliness or something would emerge from that exercise. Patricia, what do you think?
Yeah, I think really thinking about your role is really important, and you have to be very careful not to sort of take one side versus the other, because I agree with Steve that there is often far more commonality than you could ever imagine. And your job is to facilitate percolating up the commonality. And where people are getting caught up, and it's especially today in this environment of social media and of sort of 140 character bytes are supposed to be enough to get a point across, help them expand their conversation, expand the dialogue, and keep away from tactical issues and political issues. Politics are far smaller than values, and values are even smaller than principles. So I think about when our country was founded. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Like, they agreed on their values and their principles before they created anything. All men are created equal, you know, we go on from there. There are ways to do it. I think sometimes it's subtle. You have to have enough intuition. What I do is I interview people separately so that you're not all in the same room and you don't give them a chance to shut each other down. And I hear them using almost the same words, even though they're telling me, oh, I'm very different from my family. I was like, oh, that's really interesting. And then they use the exact same word to describe something. Then what I try to do is facilitate the discussion so that they then have a way of expressing it to each other, but it's my job to facilitate them getting there. So I think getting training as a facilitator is really important. It's very hard for lawyers because your job is adversarial in our system. So I don't think lawyers are the people to lead this. I think there are techniques out there that we obviously can't get into today. There's also something that we don't talk much about, but when does the family have to do things together and when can they do it apart is really important. And if you get people caught up in that whirlwind chasing, you know, they're wrong, they're wrong, they're wrong. Okay, you don't have to agree on how you're raising your children, but you might have to agree on how you're running this business together or what the purpose of the business is. You don't have to agree on, you know, faith or religion, but you might have to agree on whether this trust will continue. So clarify what they have to agree on, where values play a part in that, then you can start distinguishing a bit. And then just say, okay, you don't have to be in business together, but you can actually stay a family together. I'm just thinking, can you elaborate on how a family might align their family business action practices with their philanthropy and values? Seems like a wonderfully engaging way to put values into practice in a very intentional way. So I thought you were asking a question following up on the bring them from miles apart. Let me finish my last thought, which was let them know when they can leave each other, but also know that family systems theory from a psychological perspective says that people who cut off from each other and don't speak to each other actually are more attached to each other than they would be if they stayed engaged. So it's a really interesting concept. People say, I left my family, and they're in Australia and they're talking about their family all the time. So know what it means to be together and be apart. Get yourself trained on systems theory, really important. Aligning the family business actions and practices with philanthropy and values. So I have a pyramid that I created a long time ago, just like Steve's pyramid. At the top, I have the principles, then I have policies, and then I have practices. And what I try and test with families is, okay, you've agreed on your principles, you've applied them in your philanthropy. Have you applied them in your business, or have you applied them in your wealth? You believe in education and you're not educating your employees, there's a disconnect. You believe in education, but your philanthropy doesn't include anything in education. So maybe you should include that in part of the philanthropy. If your family business practices, if you believe in entrepreneurship, and yet you have a very hierarchical family business where nobody's allowed to take a risk, you're probably not living your values in there. And that's where you create some policies in the philanthropy and some practices in the philanthropy and the business that would align with those overriding principles. Steve, what would you add?
I would just add, happily, we're seeing far better alignment, there's that word again, between business mission and business philanthropy. 20, 50 years ago, that was less the case than today. It reminds me of working with a major tech company that you all know many years ago, and its mission really was to promote, disseminate knowledge and information. And they created a philanthropic program in part for the corporation, in part for their employees, built around information, knowledge, and education. Anyway, that's a great question.
Yeah, and I think if you think about the stakeholdership concept as opposed to shareholder concept, you think about how a family business is a big part of any community that it is in. And often it was expressing itself purely through its philanthropy. There are many thoughtful family businesses who have then incorporated some of those same principles in their family business. So they have daycare for employees. They have opportunities to get educational scholarships. They have,
I'm sorry for breaking in. We've got about 2 minutes left for maybe a final question.
Oh, I didn't think we were going to take any more questions. I was going to hand it over to you, Barry.
Oh, then please continue. You've got 2 minutes.
Yeah, no, okay. Unless, do we have any other questions?
I've got a question, Patricia.
Sure.
What's the relation between legacy and an epitaph? I was thinking as you were speaking about the famous epitaph, may have appeared on a tombstone. I wish I'd spent more time at the office.
Yeah.
I assume that an epitaph can be an expression, a pithy summation of legacy, but not really.
Yeah, I feel like it's a little bit of a semantics, I think, issue. I think legacy is a living thing that goes on beyond you in experiences, and an epitaph is a summary of one's life that's usually pretty, it's distilled down so small that it's not a big enough concept for legacy.
Yeah, I think that's well put.
Yeah.
Thank you for indulging that random thought. Okay, Barry, back to
Barry,
you.
time's up.
Well, first and foremost, Patricia, thank you so very much. And Steve, we had any number of wonderful comments after your first webinar, which was just a couple days ago. And if it's possible, I think today's was even better. I cannot thank you enough for the time and the effort that you put into making this such a success. Folks, if you have questions for Patricia or Steve, or you have questions for either Mark or myself, you can reach out to me or Mark. Our business cards, as you can see on screen, have our phone numbers, even though at the moment we are all still working from home because of COVID-19. Our office phones ring straight to our mobile phones. We'll be happy to help you in any way. I certainly want to thank Natasha Roberts for her help with this program, and absolutely with Mark Williams, who has been truly a great, great coordinator in making all of this happen. If you are around next month, well, I certainly hope you're around next month, but on January 19th, Ray Madoff, who is a professor at the Boston College of Law, she's going to be speaking about wealth equity and its role in charitable giving. And I certainly invite 2 o'clock on the 19th of January, and that program will be repeated on Thursday, the 21st of January at 5 p.m., both times Eastern. So I do hope you can be with us for that. If you have any other questions at all, please do not hesitate to call me or Mark, or send us an email, barry.nicholsberg@cartercenter.org or mark.williams@cartercenter.org. For all of us at the Carter Center, I want to thank you ever so much for your time and patience. Wish you a happy and healthy holiday season. God bless.
Thank you. Good night.
Happy Hanukkah.